Hi everybody, welcome to the next module on research, locating, evaluating, and integrating research sources. Now, it's interesting to note that most library research you do, particularly with philosophy, is going to be irrelevant. It's important to note that you can't really solve philosophical problems by looking up the answer. Our goal is to try to understand some concept or phenomenon or idea. And so we might have competing theories about what is right, what is wrong. And there isn't just a consensus as to what the answer to any given problem is. That's what the philosophy paper is about, presenting your argument for why the world is the way that it is. And so you can't necessarily find that answer in a book. It's about your interaction with the material. If you were able to look up the answer, then it wouldn't really merit our philosophical consideration. This is usually the case when we write a thesis that's too simplistic. When we write a thesis that's too simplistic, then it doesn't take a long time to prove that's the case. Go back to the idea of a too factual thesis statement. If it's factual, then there's not going to be an argument. There just is a right and a wrong, a true and a false, and writing a paper isn't really going to do anything philosophically to help us understand some dilemma. Also, if there were an answer, then it wouldn't be philosophically interesting. You're not actually doing philosophy if you can just look up the answer. So when we're writing a philosophy paper, it's important to think that most of the work that's being done is between you and your brain before you even get to writing anything on the piece of paper. It's not about researching necessarily. It's about developing and coming up with a good argument for why you think the answer to the question is the correct answer. And so there's no real substitute here for thinking hard. And this is kind of the beauty with philosophy and writing argumentative essays. The work can be done virtually anywhere. It's just a requirement that you think hard and critically about the problem and then express your position on the paper. When you're writing, it's important that you're not delaying that meaty part of the paper for just factual information that you can find in books. If a philosophy paper or an argumentative essay is all about persuasion and using logic and critical thinking to persuade the reader to believe a specific point, then it's not really important to introduce irrelevant facts that don't really have relevance for the philosophical conclusion that you're trying to make. Instead, spend the time organizing, developing, contextualizing your argument so that when you express the premises and the conclusion, when it's laid out in full, it is doing the persuasive work for you. So one of the first things that you have to do before conducting research, it's really understand the paper's boundaries. And this is going to come about prior to even discovering or coming up with a thesis statement. Remember from the previous modules that the length of your paper is going to depend on the narrowness of your thesis statement. And so when we understand what the requirements are in terms of length, objective, then we can start to create a thesis statement that has a focused or broad perspective that we can lay out in a specific way, and that we can lay out in a way that we're proving our case to the reader. So we want to be able to develop our own position on a topic, not merely patch together other people's ideas. So when you think about doing research, we're not doing research so that we can copy and paste what other people say about something to prove why we are right. Instead, we're creating our own position and then supporting our premises with other people's references so we can support those ideas. So if you think back to how we structure an argument, we structure an argument in that standard form, premise, premise, conclusion way. If our premises are true, then it ought to deductively guarantee that our conclusion is true. So when we form an argument, it's imperative that we express our own position, our own reasons for why we believe something, and then we use the references that we find to support our premises. So for instance, if I were to write a paper about the best ethical approach to creating a business, I'm not going to, prior to coming up with a thesis statement, look at business ethics books or take the anecdotes or testimonials of those in business, see what they say, and merely copy what they say. Instead, I'm going to think of my own answer for the best ethical system with regards to a business. And I'm going to think why that particular system is the best system. Now, my argument will be laid out in that premise, premise, conclusion form. With my thesis statement, the conclusion to my argument, stating that X is the best ethical system for a particular business. And the reason I know that is because of Y and Z. So that if Y and Z are true, I will know that X is true. Now, if this is my argument, I'm not going to look up references about X. Instead, I'm going to look up references for Y and Z. Because it's if Y and Z are true, they make X true, not me just trying to find somebody else's argument for why X is true. So it's important when we're laying out our argument and developing our own position, we understand that we're not looking up references for our thesis, but instead looking up references to support our premises. Because if you've argued properly, then when your premises are true, your conclusion must be true. And that's going to be the idea of developing your own position and presenting a persuasive paper. You are presenting your argument and explaining why your argument is the best argument. And you're using references to support your argument. Now, it's important that when you're beginning the research, you're conducting the preliminary research prior to a final thesis statement being written. And the reason we do this is because when we develop our position, we shouldn't develop it in such a strict way that no matter what we research, we can't be swayed by other information. So I don't want to take a stubborn position of believing X, and then I go to research X, and I find out that there's more research that points to the other side of the argument. When this happens, we tend to dig our heels in and simply only choose the resources that support our position. But this is not a good way to do philosophy. Remember, philosophy is about understanding. So our thesis, our thesis statement, should at the beginning stages of the research be flexible. So that if I'm going to argue that global warming is not real, is not a real threat to the world, I want to be able to change that thesis statement if it turns out the research is telling me otherwise. I wouldn't want to create a thesis statement that said global warming is not a real threat to the planet, and then start doing the research and finding contradictory information and having to go to obscure websites and journals just to find something to support my position. Instead, what I want to do is I want to think of what my position is, start to do research and see where the research is leading me, and then based on all of that research, I will come to an informed position and create my own argument for why global warming is a problem that is facing the planet. This is how the preliminary research is done. It's important to note that when we're doing this research, that we want to be finding material from multiple perspectives. This way, we're getting multiple arguments on both sides of the issue. And we can determine which arguments are good and which arguments are bad or mistaken. That way, we're addressing the problems from these sources. Remember, when you do research, you are looking to somebody else and their research to support your position. But many times, other people's research or positions or arguments are flawed in themselves, and so they don't make good references when it comes to supporting you and your position. It's all about finding your original position, your original angle on an issue, coming up with your own original argument. So what are your reasons for why something is true? What is your evidence? Express those reasons and then support those reasons with references. And when you're conducting the research, it's important that you're evaluating the resource in the right sort of way. And there's certain criteria that we look to determine whether or not an argument is going to be a good reference. So for instance, looking at the relevance, is the material that's being expressed in a reference influential or is it irrelevant? Many times we find supporting evidence in somebody else's anecdote or somebody else's example without really noticing that that anecdote or example is not really relevant to our position. It just talks about the same thing. Think back to the fallacies we looked at and think about the fallacy of the red herring. We often confuse things that are similar just because they have a similar vocabulary, when in reality they're not really representative of one another. So it's important that the relevance of each source that you find, each reference that you find, is supportive for your particular position. So again, think back to the standard form structure of an argument. If I have two premises and a conclusion, then I want to lay out my paper in a way where I'm expressing the argument in its entirety in the introduction, and then I spend a paragraph arguing for premise one. And in that paragraph where I'm arguing for premise one, I am using relevant material to express why premise one is true. Once I'm able to do that by using a reference that's either an example or anecdote, statistic, fact, that has the focus to prove my premise true, then I will use that in my paragraph supporting that premise. And once I have done that, then I move on to premise two in the next paragraph. And in the next paragraph, I am finding expert opinion, anecdotes, examples, statistics, whatever it takes to prove that premise two is true. So I'm finding relevant material to prove my premise two. Once I'm done proving premise two, I now have a paragraph that summarizes the argument, the introduction. I have a paragraph that expresses my first premise and then defends that premise's truth with a reference. Then I have another paragraph that expresses premise two and uses references to justify why my premise two is true. Then all I need to do is add on a conclusion that summarizes everything that I've expressed, and then proceeds with final thoughts and perhaps calls to action. And then I've got my paper written. So it's the references that are going to help us prove our premises. Because remember, when your premises are true, they should deductively or inductively lead to the conclusion being either true or probable. Now, it's also important that when we're evaluating sources, that we're looking at the timeliness in which they're written. Is it the case that the reference that you've chosen or found to support your position is recent, or is it quite outdated? Now, if we're looking to philosophy, for instance, it might be acceptable to find a reference that's dated back 100 years or 200 years. Taking support from Aristotle in 400 BCE might be acceptable within my field in philosophy. However, if I'm writing a paper on computers, it's very important that that particular reference be one that is very recent, because change occurs so quickly within the field of computers that I cannot use an outdated source, because the more outdated it is, the less true or supportive it will be. Similarly, what type of source are you using? Is it scientific? Is it anecdotal? Is it an editorial from a newspaper? Be sure that when you are referencing, you are doing so from journals, from justifiable sources that have a reputation, that are deemed academically appropriate. This is where your library database will come in handy. If you go through the library, you can access databases. Two of the databases that I recommend using, particularly for philosophical work, is JSTOR and EBSCO host. These two journal databases will allow you to access academic journals. And so the seriousness of the approach of these journals is at the top level. We don't want to be finding material that's from too biased of source. We don't want to find material that has too many opinions without good stated arguments, or too strong of conclusions, because they're not as reputable. They won't be as supportive, because there's going to be a lot of fallacious components that come into those particular references. We want to find good academic, scientific, recent, influential sources. So when we find references, when we find resources, we want to make sure that we're putting them through the ringer. We're analyzing them, we're synthesizing them. And only once we've analyzed and synthesized the references do we record the information. So it's helpful when you're doing your reading to identify things that you would like to import into your paper. So for instance, if I have an argument that has two premises and I'm doing research on premise 1, I want to find a reference and analyze it, synthesize the material, make sure that it makes sense, that it's recent, that it's from a scientific journal or an academic journal. And then once I know that it's a good piece of source material that will support my premise 1, I will write down the quote or summarize the piece of writing that I think is going to be most supportive of my position, of my premise 1. That way, when it comes time to write the paper, all I will really need to do is import in that summary and where that summary came from, and then explain that summary. So we kind of think of this as the hamburger way of referencing material, right? When you think of a hamburger as being a bun, a patty, and then the other bun. When you're referencing material, you want that quote or summary or the paraphrased material to be the meat. That's going to be the thing that is going to support your position. So when you're writing a paper, you want to make sure that you put in that meat, that summary or that paraphrasing. But before you do that, you need to introduce the material. So if I'm trying to prove my premise 1, I will make reference to this summary, explaining that I got the material from so-and-so's academic journal, or that somebody with this educational background developed this theory, essentially setting up the relevance, setting up the credibility of the summary that I'm going to use. I then state the summary, and then I explain that summary or quote or paraphrase. So within each piece of referenced material, there should be at least 3 sentences worth of information. The setup, the actual source material that you're going to be using, and then an explanation about why that material is so important to your particular thesis. That way, you're explaining the credibility and the relevance, you're explaining why the particular premise of yours is true and the supporting evidence is true, and then explaining how that all relates to your thesis statement. So in each paragraph, when you reference material, you are reinforcing your thesis, you are reinforcing your argument based on the material that you are using to source to justify that position. And it's very important that when you're doing that, you are giving reference to the person whose material you are taking. Otherwise, you are plagiarizing, and it is imperative that you do not plagiarize. This is the cardinal sin of academia. Do not take somebody else's words or ideas as your own. You are using their material to support your material. So we want to give them credit for their ideas or words. So as we're analyzing this material that we're referencing, make sure that you're coming up with central ideas, key details, supporting points, and to think how that material helps your particular thesis. In addition, make sure that you're finding material that conflicts with your particular topic. It's important that when we write, that not only do we support our position, but we recognize areas where we might be wrong and come up with counter-arguments for why it might be acceptable to believe the opposite position. Ultimately, however, we are going to argue for our position because prior to even writing the paper, we have already decided which position is more accurate. So even though my position is more accurate, there will still be problems or questions that arise to why my position is the right one. It's important that I'm finding material that goes against my position. But ultimately, in the end, there will be more overwhelming and accurate information that suggests my position, my thesis statement, is correct. So when it comes to recording, you're making sure that you're using the proper quotations, you're able to summarize the material that you've referenced or paraphrase the material that you've referenced, and that you're documenting everything that you've taken from other people. So when you're writing a philosophy paper, research will be involved, but it's not going to be the main focus. Instead, it's your argument that is going to be the main focus. So don't get discouraged by the idea that it might take more time to come up with a good thesis statement versus coming up with supporting evidence for your premises. This is absolutely normal and is acceptable and encouraged, that this should be the way that papers are written. We want to make sure that we're arguing the right position, and Creating that argument is difficult. Finding supporting information for why certain premises are true, that may not take as long, but when we do that referencing, make sure that we're finding proper, good material to support our justification for the thesis.